And one of the major themes that I wanted to spend time on today is the leaders, the reaction or the response to what's happening of the military leadership in this country, because that's significant as well. And so those two things are the things I wanted to really spend time with today: the economy and the military pushback against what's happened in Washington and other places. And I'm speaking specifically of President Trump's walk to St. John's Church last Monday evening, and the clearing out of Lafayette Park, and what all of this has meant, and what seems to be going on. So that's really what I had in mind about today's program. And then there were a couple of other things I wanted to share with you at the same time. But first, I want to make sure that you have the 800 number so you can call in if you are indeed inclined to do so. As I mentioned, we would love to hear from you. As I always mention, we would love to hear from you. And what I want to emphasize once again, that you don't have to wait until a particular time or a particular topic before, if you've got something to say, whether it's an observation, a comment, a question, a concern, a suggestion, whatever it might be, that is related to the program, you can be sure not only that I'll appreciate hearing from you on it, but that our other listeners would as well. And for that purpose, we have set aside an 800 number, which is obviously toll free. And it's an opportunity for you to come on the air directly. And at any time that we're on, during the 2 hours we're on the air, that number is there and it's waiting for you. So please don't feel that you need to wait for an appropriate time or the top of an hour or something like that. Because as you know, and I do this, and I've always done this kind of thing, frequently what you do is you wait for the commercial breaks. But as you know, there are no commercial breaks on the Head On Radio Network. And that's one of the strengths of it, I think, is that we don't have other people dictating what's covered and what's not covered on the programs that you hear on the Head On Radio Network. And that is, I think, appealing. But when you do have commercial messages, that means you have periodic breaks in the action. And these breaks in the action oftentimes provide a convenient point at which people feel comfortable sharing their thoughts or ideas with you. We don't have those. And so consequently, we usually take a break at the top of at halfway between the first hour and the second hour. But it's not a commercial break as necessarily. It's a physical break. Because very honestly, to go a full hour without a break can be tough, as I'm sure many of you can appreciate. And many of you listen intently, and I especially appreciate that. And listening intently is work. It's tiring, it's exhausting, because your mind is going all the time. And that's what we hope for. That's what we thrive on. And so my point is that not only do I need a break, but I really am certain in many cases that those listening to the program need a break as well. And that's really what the break at the top of the hour is really about. I think it's a necessity more than a convenience. And again, it's definitely not a break that gives us an opportunity to sell anything or promote anything, or what you would find with regular commercial breaks. But because they are breaks, they provide opportunities for people that want to join in or comment or whatever. And I'm concerned that a lot of people listening might have something to say and are waiting for the appropriate time to say it. And what I want you to know is that there really isn't an appropriate time. When you say it, that makes it an appropriate time. When you call, whatever we're doing, whatever the topic is, your call becomes the priority at that moment. And I want you to know that it is solicited, invited, and I want you to know that we appreciate that. We would appreciate that very much. The number is 844-THE-HORN. 844-843-4676. But again, much easier to remember, 844-THE-HORN, H-O-R-N, Head On Radio Network, obviously. If you'd like to send a comment and make a comment directly to me and not come on the air, you can do it in two ways, either by sending me an email or by making a comment through our Facebook page. If you'd like to send me an email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. Again, that's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And that's all lowercase, one word, no punctuation, no capitals, no capital letters, nothing like that. waobrien906@gmail.com. If you'd like to make your comment by using our Facebook page, since so many of us are on Facebook these days, then that's very easy as well. Just go to our Facebook page. And of course, you do that by going to the homepage of Facebook, facebook.com. And at the search box at the top, in the search box at the top of the homepage, just type in the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution, and Facebook will immediately take you to our Facebook page. And on that Facebook page, you'll see a number of postings that I've put on there. And at the end of each posting, there are two computer links. There's a share link and a comment link. If you click on the share link, it sends that particular posting, not all the postings on our Facebook page, just that one, to all the friends in your Facebook account. And of course, if there's a particular posting on our Facebook page that you feel that strongly about or that drawn to, because it really says something you'd like to share with your friends on your Facebook page, then you don't have to write each friend individually. All you need to do is click on the share button at the end of one of the postings on our Facebook page, and it'll send that posting to everybody, all your friends on your Facebook account. That gives us more exposure, wider exposure, and obviously we would appreciate that. And as the person who put the posting on the Facebook page in the first place, I just want you to know that I would appreciate it as well. If you click on the comment button, then that gives you an opportunity to send a comment directly to me. And the minute you post your comment, the minute you hit post after you make your comment, my Facebook account alerts me that there has been a comment made to one of the postings on our Facebook page. And then Facebook takes me to the posting and to your comment. Facebook's assumption, of course, is that the comment and the posting would be connected, would be related. And I've tried to point out that while that's the assumption, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, because I don't want you to think that your ability to comment on the program requires that there be a posting on the same subject you want to comment on. I think that's asking a little bit much. So you needn't do that. Even if your comment has nothing to do with the posting that you select for your comment, just by reading the comment, I will know basically what the point is that you are making in your comment. So the point is, whatever you choose to do, please know that it is appreciated, it is solicited, and it is appreciated. And I want to take the opportunity to thank you for your continued support of this program and your continued support of the Hit On Radio Network and the work that Bob Kincaid and Agnes do to bring these programs to you on a regular basis. So with that, let's get into a little bit of some of what's going on in our world today. And it's interesting. We've mentioned so much about the actions of the president and what's happening and what's been happening during the protests over the murder of George Floyd. And we talked about it in our time together last week, but we haven't been together, as you know, since last Wednesday. So, and I did mention this in our last program on Wednesday, the fact that among those people who have been outspoken in their criticisms of this president and some of the behavior that he has demonstrated is none other than Greg Popovich, the NBA coach of the San Antonio team in the NBA. And in this piece, which appeared in the Washington Post on June 2nd, which was early last week, Greg Popovich referred to President Trump as, quote, a deranged idiot, and then criticized the president for his lack of leadership. And in the process, Popovich also challenged three prominent Republicans for their unfailing support of the president. Popovich referred to Donald Trump as a soulless coward, a deranged idiot, a fool, and a destroyer. And I got a couple of quotes here that I've kind of bracketed that I wanted to share with you. And I think we may have mentioned a couple of these before, but I did want to, because I really think they lead directly into the program, because they kind of set a tone for the subject that I believe is coming. Popovich wrote in the Washington Post, "It's unbelievable. If Trump had a brain, even if it was 99% cynical, he'd come out and say something to unify people. But he doesn't care about bringing people together. Even now, that's how deranged he is. It's all about him. It's all about what benefits him personally. It's never about the greater good. And that's all he's ever been." And Popovich goes on, "It's so clear what needs to be done. We need a president to come out and say simply that Black Lives Matter. Just say those three words. But he won't and he can't. He can't because it's more important to him to mollify the small group of followers who validate his insanity. But it's more than just Trump," Popovich writes. "The system has to change. I'll do whatever I can do to help, because that's what leaders do. But he can't do anything to put us on a positive path because he's not a leader." And then he took off on the three Republicans who are amongst the major supporters of President Trump: Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, and Mitch McConnell. And of course, he points out, and I'll also make this point later in this program, because one of the articles I want to bring to your attention focuses on Lindsey Graham and Mitt Romney as two of the Republican leaders And basically the theme of the article is, what does it take for people who appear for the most part to be collaborators? What does it take for a collaborator to stop collaborating? Is there a point at which they won't go, beyond which they won't go? Well, if you'd mentioned just these two names, Mitt Romney and Lindsey Graham, it's clear that Lindsey Graham hasn't reached that point, if indeed he ever will. But Mitt Romney is the one who cast the only Republican vote in the Senate in support of removing President Trump after he was impeached during the trial for impeachment. Popovich says about Mitch McConnell, in the end, what we have is a fool in place of a president, while the person who really runs the country, Senator Mitch McConnell, is destroying the United States for generations to come. McConnell has destroyed and degraded our judicial system. He's tried to destroy health care. He's destroyed the environment. He's the master and Trump's the stooge. And what's funny is that Trump doesn't even know it. Trump always wanted to be part of the in-group. But McConnell is an in-group of one, and Trump is playing the fool. That's Greg Popovich, a professional basketball coach. And one of the reason I mentioned that article, and the reason I wanted to share those quotes with you, is principally because of who Greg Popovich is. Or let me change that around a little bit, of who he isn't. He's never been known as a political commentator. This is something that I have thought about mentioning on the program before, and I kind of filed it away in the back of my mind, and I thought, well, if there's ever occasion to come up with this might be good to, as a fill-in for the last 10 minutes or 15 minutes of an hour or something, rather than start a new topic that you would have to carry over into the next program. This would be one of those little short items that you could cover in 10 or 15 minutes. But after rereading this piece by Popovich, and I know I mentioned it in last Wednesday's program, one of the things I began to think about once again is this theme. And the theme I'm referring to here is the fact that because of the pandemic, because of the coronavirus, pro sports, professional athletics, as well as amateur athletics, has been shut down in this country for all practical purposes. And for those who are sports fans, and I'm not basically suggesting that everybody is, I know that everybody isn't. I've always considered myself to be one. I don't know if I'm a good, what you would call a good sports fan, but I am a sports fan. I've always enjoyed it my whole life. And one of the things that has dawned on me is that with professional sports having been shut down for the last 10, 12 weeks, those in the nation who are fanatical sports fans, and there are many, and if you don't believe that, just look at the number of talk shows, entire networks on the air devoted to sports conversation. 24/7 round-the-clock networks that talk nothing else but sports. Think of ESPN. Never mind NBC Sports and CBS Sports and Fox Sports. Just look at ESPN, where sports is all they do. and their listenership is exploding. There's a market out there, a huge market in this country for sports conversation and a general love of sports. And for 3 months, we haven't had it. And I've seen, as one would naturally expect, realizing that these are businesses, that some networks have had to cut their staffs, especially in their sports programming, because there's no sports. It hasn't been going on. And now, as the nation begins to open up again, and the big thing today, this Monday, June 8th, is that New York itself now, which suffered the brunt of the coronavirus, the brunt of the attacks, the brunt of the number of deaths, even New York City is beginning to reopen this week. So with that, the sports networks, the sports programming has continued to function. In a few cases, they've begun to import sports from other places in the world. I know, for example, that there are, I believe on ESPN2, live broadcasts of baseball games from South Korea that have been going on. And I think it's based on the idea that people love their sports so much. But the fact of the matter is, and I've thought about this because I consider myself a sports fan. And I've tried to psych myself or to examine my own psyche on this matter. Am I the kind of fanatic sports fan that'll watch athletics no matter who's playing? And I have to admit I'm not. I have my favorite teams in most of the major sports. I have favorite athletes on many of these teams. Or if it's something like tennis or golf, I have favorite players. And I'll watch them. But I don't watch the athletics on television just for the fact that it's on. I've got to have an interest in it to watch it. So, for example, I've said this many times, not only am I a big football fan, but, and my football, the fact that I am a football fan revolves around the support for the New England Patriots. And I've said that numerous times on this program. And I know that brings me enemies. I have a Patriots Super Bowl champion hat from the last Patriots Super Bowl victory that I wear around town all the time. And I've had a number of friends say to me, you better be careful where you wear that hat. Everybody is not that crazy about the New England Patriots. And I know that. But I am, and I have been for a long time. But I also support the Boston Bruins in hockey and the Celtics and the Red Sox and all of that. So maybe I'm more of a New England fan than a sports fan. But the reality is I have to have an interest in one of the teams to sit through an entire game. Oftentimes I'll scan the networks to see what games are being covered on a weekend when athletics is underway, which it isn't now. But it's amazed me for the last 3 months that even though we haven't had any sports going on, the networks continue to broadcast. And sports fans continue to watch. And one of the things that I've noticed, that since there aren't games to talk about on the air, more and more of the sports conversation have begun moving in the direction of politics. More and more of these sports commentators are dipping their feet into politics. Not a lot, but more than they ever did when sports were going on. And that's one of the things that struck me about Greg Popovich's article and commentary on Donald Trump in the Washington Post. It's very obvious from reading Popovich that his interest in politics didn't now suddenly appear. It's very clear from the depth of what he writes in the Washington Post, in his op-ed in the Washington Post on June 2nd. It's very obvious that Greg Popovich has had an interest in politics for a long time. But while the NBA was playing games, while professional sports was going on, while he was on recruiting trips in the off-season and all of that, you didn't expect Greg Popovich to talk that much about politics. But now that there's no athletics going on, here's Popovich writing an op-ed in the Washington Post on President Trump. And I've heard a number of other sports programs on the air, on radio, talking about subjects that are closer to politics than they are to sports as well. I really believe that what we're into because of the pandemic has created an environment where even the people who spend their lives on the perimeters, on the outer edge of an interest in politics, are now moving into the mainstream of conversation about politics. In other words, what I'm seeing, and I think it's in large part because of the pandemic and everything's shut down. The economy, in effect, has been shut down for better than 10 weeks. What we're seeing is that more and more people are indicating an interest in politics. The nation is becoming more political. Interest in politics is increasing as there's a lack of other things to keep people interested. And I've wondered, and all I could do is wonder, but I've wondered whether this would work to the detriment of the President of the United States. Because I've believed for a long time that much of his behavior, much of what he's done, not only during the campaign of 2016, but since he's been in office, much of his more outlandish behavior, I've believed has been in part because he believes that most of the people in this country aren't watching him or listening to him. That he's operating on the assumption that there's a certain element in this nation that's political, and that there's a large element of this country that is apolitical, that's not political. And that has meant that he's dared to say things and do things that he wouldn't dare do or say if he felt that the entire nation was watching. But the irony is that because of the pandemic, they are watching now. And so consequently, much of what he would have been able to get away with before, he's not able to get away with as easily now. We've always known that his supporters, his most loyal supporters, his most fanatical supporters, are a minority. They're a significant minority, but they're a minority. But with more and more people watching, that minority has become even a greater minority. The president was able to get away with and do things before because the minority that supported him was so significantly large in a political population that he felt he had enough support among his base to be able to get away with what he was doing. But now that more and more people are watching, I've kind of guessed or speculated that it's becoming more and more risky for him because his minority support is shrinking, not because those who support him are abandoning him. Some are, but I do believe they're very few, relatively speaking. But the reason his minority seems smaller is because the group of people that are more politically aware has grown precipitously because of the pandemic. I think the nation itself is becoming more political because there really hasn't been that much else to keep people interested. There's been no sports. You can't go to movies. And let's face it, in spite of the fact there are X numbers of channels available for watching on television, television itself, after a time, becomes tiring. No matter what you watch, even if you do have your favorite programs, you can't watch it all the time. And part of the reason is because watching television, by definition, is kind of something you do alone or in close proximity with people in your household or whatever. But you can't do it with the size of a movie theater audience because the pandemic has made that impossible. And people get tired of watching television by themselves, or relatively speaking, alone, or only with the closest people around them. And more people, it seems to me, are becoming outspoken and interested in politics. They're taking the positions. They're making their voices heard. I was stunned when I looked at the Washington Post and saw Greg Popovich's name as the author of one of the op-eds on the op-ed page. It's not that I know Greg Popovich that well, but I do know him well enough as a basketball coach to know that he doesn't regularly appear on the op-ed pages of our major newspapers. It's obvious, as I mentioned, from his piece, from his op-ed, from his article, that his interest in politics is not sudden. He's obviously had an interest in politics. The depth with which he speaks indicate that. But as a basketball coach, he's not been in a position before to come out publicly and take a position on political issues, but he does now. Look at the traction that the protest of Colin Kaepernick from 2016 is getting and still gets. The number of people taking the number of professional athletes who were taking a knee during the Star-Spangled Banner, which I believe, as a sports fan, pretty much led to Kaepernick's being blackballed by the owners of professional teams in the National Football League. I believe that. Because let's face it, Kaepernick is a quality quarterback. He's not just a name. He's a name of somebody who has skills and talent. And in the past, skills and talent like he possesses would never have gone unclaimed for 4 years. But yet nobody's gone near Colin Kaepernick, at least not yet. But now that the commissioner has come out in support of the protests and in support of those protesting, now that the commissioner of the National Football League has acknowledged that he was wrong to criticize those players who took a knee, the thinking is that this might be an opportunity for Kaepernick that many people had concluded he'd never again get. And that indeed might be true. I'm reading a number of editorials, a number of columns, where sports writers in Boston, in New England, are basically strongly suggesting that the New England Patriots use the occasion of Tom Brady leaving the Patriots to make a move for Kaepernick. So far, there has been no movement on that. But a number of prominent sports writers in the New England area are talking about it. Now that the league has come around and is more supportive of what Kaepernick did, the thinking is that this might result in Kaepernick getting a bid by some team. And these guys, and I mentioned guys figuratively because there are a couple of women sports commentators in the New England media as well. These people believe that Kaepernick might directly benefit from this change in mood or change in temperament that is taking place. But that's really an aside. The issue that I wanted to deal with is the fact that because we don't have professional sports, haven't had professional sports for some time, and a lot of these people, a lot of these sports fans are becoming very excited because NBA players are now back in practice playing for what promises to be an abbreviated season. But it's an abbreviated season that's going to lead directly into the next season. So in effect, what we're seeing now is the equivalent of the training season, which is going to begin with ending the previous season and then going directly into a totally new season. The National Hockey League the same way. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, there was serious question as to whether professional baseball is going to come back at all, because the players and the owners are at odds. You know, the gap between them is huge because they're talking about an abbreviated season without fans. And the owners are looking at something approaching $750,000 per game that they'll lose. And therefore, the owners are trying to get by with a portion of a season that contains as few games as possible because they anticipate that they're going to lose $500,000 to $750,000 for each game that's played. The players, on the other hand, are lobbying for a season with as many games in it as they can get because they're being paid, you know, on a per game basis, so to speak, although they're under contract. But when you look at the contract, you begin to get a number as to what the average pay per game is for each player. And they're operating on that assumption, and they want as many games as possible. So because of the gap between the players and the owners, there's some serious question among many people whether there'll be a baseball season or not in 2020. But be that as it may, I think the political audience in this country has increased because of the pandemic. It's increased significantly. And I think the Popovich piece kind of speaks to that and reinforces that, which is the reason I wanted to share it with you. We have a few minutes. We have about 8 minutes left in our first hour. I honestly didn't expect so much of the first hour to be used up with that sports issue, but that's all right. But I did want to share with you an article by Bret Stephens in the New York Times dated June 5th. Today is June 8th. So this is the end of last week, toward the end of last week. June 5th was Friday, in fact. And what I wanted to emphasize, because it's on Donald Trump and it's a criticism of Donald Trump. But there were two things about Bret Stephens' piece that I wanted to mention to you. First of all, Bret Stephens is a conservative. He's one of the more conservative writers on the New York Times staff. That doesn't mean that I don't respect him as a columnist, as an opinion writer, as a journalist. Bret Stephens is one of the best writers out there, I believe. His columns are a joy to read, unless the subject that he's writing about is so alien that the subject itself turns you off. I find myself many times relishing Bret Stephens' columns for the way he says what he says. And I don't believe that that's common. There are a lot of people out there who are accomplished journalists who write good English, obviously. They're successful columnists, they're successful journalists. But you don't comment on their journalism because of the skills of writing that they employ. Bret Stephens is an exception. I find myself reading Bret Stephens on a regular basis, even though I oftentimes disagree with what he's saying, because I respect the way he says it. And I wanted to share that with you, and at the same time bring you kind of a short summation, if you will, of this particular piece that appeared in the New York Times on Friday morning. Because in it, and I was interested in this, Stephens mentions that he taught a seminar this spring, obviously online, at the University of Chicago. And the title of the course that he taught was on the Art of Political Persuasion. And in this piece that he wrote Friday, he tells us that in that course, he used speeches or columns by Abraham Lincoln, Pericles, Martin Luther King, George Orwell, Václav Havel, Winston Churchill, among other practitioners of political persuasion. And then he concluded the course after looking at all of these accomplished writers and speakers who are successful in their efforts to persuade people politically. He looked at Donald Trump's tweets and compared Donald Trump with all the others in the course he taught. That fascinated me when I read the piece. One of the lines, and this gives you an idea of how well he writes, because I think all of us will recognize this coming from Lincoln. Bret Stephens writes about Donald Trump, with malice toward all, with charity for none. And I think all of us recognize that that's a phrase turned around that's attributable to Abraham Lincoln and his second inaugural address. When Lincoln said, charity for all, malice toward none, Bret Stephens, in referring to Trump, turns that around to malice toward all, charity toward none. And then basically, Bret Stephens talks about Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And that in effect, Abraham Lincoln reinvented the goals of the Civil War in that speech. And that's why we remember the speech. He cites in his article Václav Havel, who criticized communist tyranny. In his role as head, I believe, of the Czech Republic. Havel wrote a piece entitled The Power of the Powerless. And basically talks about exactly that, the power of the powerless. And then Stephens cites King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where Martin Luther King mentioned that patience was no longer the answer to injustice. And King wrote, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. That's Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And in comparing Havel and Lincoln and Dr. King with Donald Trump's tweets, Bret Stephens launches into the theme of his article, which is, unlike all of these other people who practice the art of persuasion, Trump's purpose is to debase. He's not trying to persuade anybody. He's trying to say the very things that he believes his base believes. Bret Stephens said, this is speech designed for provocations and put-downs, making supporters feel smug, making opponents seethe, reducing national discourse to the level of grunts and counter-grunts. Donald Trump is not trying to persuade anybody of anything. He's trying to feed his base. He's not looking to convert anybody to his way of thinking. He just wants to make sure that he retains those who already support him. He doesn't lead his base, Bret Stephens says. He personifies it. He speaks to his followers as if he were them. He cultivates their resentments, demonizes their opponents, validates their hatreds, and glorifies himself so that they can bask in the reflections of him. And that's the difference. That's an insightful piece when you think about it. But the reason I recommend it is not only for the insight that the op-ed demonstrates, but for the way that Bret Stephens writes. His concluding paragraph. But the point here isn't that Trump is responsible for the nation's wounds. It's that he is the reason some of those wounds have festered, and why none of them can heal, at least for as long as he remains in office. Until we have a president who can say, as Lincoln did in his first inaugural, we are not enemies but friends, and be believed in the bargain, our national agony will only grow worse. And that's what Bret Stephens is talking about, and that's what he wrote last Friday in the midst of these demonstrations. I think it's powerful. When you compare that with Greg Popovich, they're both saying the same thing. Bret Stephens is an accomplished columnist. Greg Popovich is a basketball coach. And it shows in the way they say what they want to say. But I think it's important or significant that Greg Popovich, in his own way, is saying the very same kinds of things that Bret Stephens is saying in his much more polished columns. With that, we've kind of reached the end of our first hour. We've actually gone over a few minutes into our second hour. So as we usually do, I'd like to pause and take a 5-minute break and give all of you a chance for a break as well. And when we come back, I want to spend some time, maybe the bulk of the rest of our time today, talking about the military leaders who have come out in the last several days in opposition to Donald Trump. And what I believe the significance of that is, because I do believe it's extremely significant. You're listening to the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break. It is now 4 minutes after the hour of 2. So we'll be back at about 8 minutes after, 9 minutes after, and that'll leave the bulk of a full hour. So we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back with you. Please stay here. Stay with us. Thank you.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill Obrien. Bill?
I'm here.
We're here.
If I told you what the problem was, you wouldn't believe it. I got one of those paper clips, you know, the real big ones that you put. I got that holding my earphones together, and I got the microphone caught in the clip, and I couldn't get it out.
Okay, now we know what your birthday is going to come early this year. No more paper clips. Thanks, Bill.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Welcome to this, our second hour in this Monday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Monday. It is the 8th of June in the year 2020. It is a pleasure to be with you today. For those of you who've been with us through the entire program today, I want to thank you for staying with us. For those of you just joining us, I want to welcome you. And let me say, for those who are just joining us, that in the first hour, we spent quite a bit of time, of the first hour, talking about the Greg Popovich criticism of President Trump. And I had mentioned a little bit of that in our program last Wednesday. And I believe I had shared at least one of the quotations from Popovich's article with on the air last Wednesday. But I wanted to return to that because, and this is what I spent a good portion of our first hour on, it seemed to me that the impact of the pandemic, the shutting down of the economy over the last 2+ months, 10 weeks, 11 weeks, or whatever, has done is drive a number of people who traditionally aren't that interested in politics to become much more interested and outspoken. And I see Popovich's article that way. I mean, I think there's no question that Popovich is outraged by some of the things that Donald Trump says and does. And it's very obvious from the depth with which he says this, that he's not new to politics. This is something, obviously, that has bothered him for a long time. But first and foremost, he's a professional coach in professional sports. He's a basketball coach. And he devotes his time and earns his living from being a basketball coach, not from making political commentary. But there is no sports now. And suddenly we read Popovich in an op-ed piece in the Washington Post. And I think what that does is symbolize one of the impacts of the coronavirus and the shutting down of the nation's economy for as many weeks as has been shut down. A lot of people that, for whatever reason, don't have the time or the inclination to dabble in politics are dabbling in politics now. And I think it may be working to the detriment of this president. Because, as I mentioned in our first hour, much of what the president says and does are outlandish. They've been outlandish. Yet he continues to do it. And I have believed that part of the reason he feels empowered to do these things is because of the strength of his base and the degree to which his base seems to always be with him. But because of the significant size of the minority that counts itself as his base, he's been able to flex that loyalty and use the backing of that loyalty to do and say some of the things that he's done and said. But now that the political world in this country has grown because there aren't professional athletics. Much of the nation has been shut down. People are becoming outspoken on political issues that never before had the time or the inclination to do that. And what that does is renders the size of Trump's supporters proportionately less. His minority is much smaller now because the base of political opposition to what this president says and does has grown precipitously because of the pandemic. Because people are now listening to and commenting on politics that up until now have had neither the time nor the inclination to do that. There's one group, and this really gets to the main theme, I believe, of this hour as I see it. There's one group that we're hearing from that we never hear from, and that's the military. More specifically, the military leadership in this country. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, previous chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, admirals. Because one of the things we know, we have known, all of us, is that the military in this country fashions itself and bends over backwards to remain apolitical. The last thing that military people in this country have wanted to allow is for military voices to become political. What makes the military in this country is its professionalism. And its professionalism demands that they not be Republican and they not be Democrat, they not be liberal, they not be conservative. Many people who are very, very much and have been for a long time into politics, as it were, political junkies, acknowledge that much of the military is inclined to support the administration, to support the leaders of the system, the government, if you will. That's obviously what the military is about. But even when there has been in the past situations and occasions where one might expect the military to open up and share its political preference or its political concerns or consternation or whatever it might be, the military has consistently refused to do that until now. I believe that's yet one more indication that what we're seeing right now may be indeed unprecedented. And as Jennifer Senior's article in the New York Times, which was just posted about an hour before we came on the air, she raises the question, are we seeing something this time that really is a little bit different than before? She thinks it may be, that this may be a real turning point. I'm thinking somewhat the same. I think I'm leaning in the same direction. I think what we're seeing now really is unprecedented. And the fact that the military leadership in this country is speaking out on issues of politics is an indication of how unprecedented I believe this period is. I had real concerns when Donald Trump even announced his candidacy. And when his Republican opponents, one by one, began to drop out of the race in 2016, and it became more and more clear that Donald Trump might actually get the nomination, then I became very concerned that he not win. And like many of the polls, I bought into the idea that he wouldn't win, that Hillary Clinton was going to easily win the presidency. And that didn't happen. It surprised me. I know it also surprised Donald Trump even more than me, because I don't think he had any idea that he could win either. But now he does. And it has bothered him ever since that the nation doesn't seem to be expressing the same respect for his victory that he feels he has coming to him. And as we know, he began the process of lying beginning with the size of the crowd at his inauguration. And it's just gone on from there. And now the fact checkers are suggesting that since the president took office, they're counting something like 19,000 blatant lies that this president has uttered as president of the United States. He continues to lie and continues to refuse to apologize for it. And we spent a lot of time on previous programs speculating as to why this might be. But like many of you, in 2016, I was really concerned when President Trump was elected. But also, like many people in this country, I also believe that some of the people he had in his administration, the John Kellys and James Mattises and others, probably would be able to keep the president in line. Obviously, time has proven me wrong, and time has proven many of those who believe the same thing wrong. And one of the things that I've gone to and mentioned this many times is when Donald Trump made the statement that he could, in the middle of the day, shoot down somebody in Times Square, and law officials would not be able to find 12 people to serve as a jury in his trial. In other words, that he was so popular that he could say and do whatever he chose to say and do. And we've seen what I think over the 3.5 years he's been president is the situation deteriorate accordingly. But the fact of the matter is, it seems to me it's important to think about that story about shooting down somebody in Fifth Avenue. And I think that's the point that is worth emphasizing. Presidents, politicians in the past, traditionally, have set out to persuade their audiences. That's why we looked at Bret Stevens' column this past hour. And I was so interested in the fact that Stevens had taught a course at the University of Chicago on the art of persuasion. Because traditionally, politicians seek more than anything else to persuade, to win converts, to secure support, to secure additional votes. This president is different. He sets out to persuade nobody who isn't already persuaded. When you think about that, and then you look at his comment about shooting down somebody in Fifth Avenue in Times Square and not being convicted for it, I think it puts that whole thing into context. Unlike previous politicians and presidents, he's not trying to persuade people that it's okay to shoot down somebody in Fifth Avenue, in Times Square. That's not his goal. His goal is to prove that he can do that and get away with it. It's the getting away with it that I think explains Donald Trump more than anything else. He's not trying to persuade people to do anything. He's trying to convince people who support him that he can do whatever he wants to do and not suffer a penalty for it. And that's become his mantra. That's kind of explained a lot of his behavior since he came into office. But the issue is, might that be changing? Might we have reached the point now where his belief that he could get away with anything is now becoming more questionable? I think the speaking out of the military leadership of this country against this president is indeed evidence that this situation is not going to be the same as previous situations. Something is different this time. And I think this military revolt, if you want to call it that, is evidence of that. Because let's face it, Jim Mattis hung in there as his Secretary of Defense for a long time. I think all of us can remember, it's not that long ago, the pride that Donald Trump took because he had James Mattis in his administration and John Kelly. And that he had been able to persuade the CEO at General Motors to join his administration as Secretary of State. He took pride in that. And at least as far as Kelly is concerned and James Mattis is concerned, these were military people. And even though they hung in there for a long time, until Trump's support of them began to dissipate, because they ended up being at odds with the president. And this president won't put up with anybody who challenges him or disagrees with him. As military people with a military background, these guys did disagree with him, did challenge him. He took it for a while. But it was understandable that at some point he would make it impossible for these people to stay. And with Mattis and Kelly both, that happened. But what's bothered me, and I'm sure it bothers many others, has bothered many others, is that even though these people left the administration, they didn't become outspoken opponents of the president. For the most part, they kept their mouths shut. And while opposition to President Trump and what he's doing and what he did after the death of George Floyd and what he didn't do in combating the pandemic, a lot of us began to wonder, where's James Mattis? Where's John Kelly? Why aren't they saying something? These are people that obviously don't agree with Donald Trump. They're gone. But they are military people. And as such, military people don't open up on their political preferences. But over the last week, that's changed. It changed with James Mattis when he published an op-ed denouncing President Trump, backing the protesters, and accusing the president of trying to turn Americans against each other. He kept silent. Now he's broken his silence. And Mattis even accuses the president of ordering the U.S. military to violate the constitutional rights of American citizens. And I wanted to share with you a couple of quotes from James Mattis's letter, from James Mattis's op-ed. Quote, I have watched this week's unfolding events, angry and appalled, Mattis says. The words equal justice under law are carved in the pediment of the United States Supreme Court. This is precisely what protesters are demanding, rightly demanding. It is a wholesome, unifying demand, one that all of us should be able to get behind. We must not be distracted by a small number of lawbreakers. The protests are defined by tens of thousands of people of conscience who are insisting that we live up to our values as people and our values as a nation. We must reject and hold accountable those in office who would make a mockery of our Constitution. Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try, says James Mattis. He tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We're witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. We can unite without him, drawing on the strength inherent in our civil society. This will not be easy, as the past few days have shown, Mattis writes. But we owe it to our fellow citizens, to past generations that bled to defend our promise, and to our children. And then he even goes so far as to contrast American unity with the ideology of Nazi Germany. Quote, instructions given by the military departments to our troops before the Normandy invasion reminded soldiers that, quote, the Nazi slogan for destroying us was divide and conquer. Our American answer to that is, in union there's strength. We must summon that unity to surmount this crisis, confident that we are better than our politics, unquote. That's James Mattis explaining the difference between American unity and the ideology that produced Nazi Germany. For a long time, James Mattis said nothing. It's only within the past week that Mattis has opened up. Quote, when you leave an administration over clear policy differences, you need to give the people who are still there as much opportunity as possible to defend the country. They still have the responsibility of protecting this great big experiment of ours. There's a period in which I owe my silence. It's not eternal. It's not going to be forever. And then Madison opened up. He explains why he hasn't opened up before now. And then he opens up. Quote, when I joined the military some 50 years ago, I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Never did I dream that troops taking that same oath would be ordered under any circumstance to violate the constitutional rights of their fellow citizens, much less to provide a bizarre photo op for the elected commander-in-chief, with military leadership standing alongside. And as we know, one of the major people who marched to St. John's with Donald Trump that last Monday evening, was the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Milley. And that's something that drew James Mattis to begin to come out and express himself. Mattis doesn't stop there. Implicitly, he criticizes the current Chief of Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, and other senior officials. Mattis says we must reject any thinking of our cities as a battle space that our uniformed military is called upon to dominate. He's using the president's own words against him. He's using Esper's words against him. We don't refer to our cities as battle space, and we don't use our troops to dominate the battle space. At home, we should use our military only when requested to do so, on very rare occasions by state governors. Militarizing our response, as we witnessed in Washington, D.C., sets up a false conflict, between the military and civil society, civilian society. It erodes the moral ground that ensures a trusted bond between men and women in uniform and the society they are sworn to protect, and of which they themselves are a part. Keeping public order rests with civilian state and local leaders, who best understand that communities are answerable to them. I have watched this week's unfolding events, angry and appalled, he says once again. In Federalist number 14, James Madison wrote, America united with a handful of troops, or without a single soldier, exhibits a more forbidding posture to foreign ambition than America disunited with 100,000 veterans ready for combat. We do not need to militarize our response to protests. We need to unite around a common purpose, and it starts by guaranteeing that all of us are equal before the law. James Madison. I was going to say James Madison. James Madison. So this was the beginning this challenge to the president is the beginning of something very unique in our country, namely former leaders of the military who have been trained not to speak out on political issues have begun to speak out. Mattis was first. But in recent days, others have followed. Mike Mullen, retired admiral. Retired General John Allen. Even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, who participated in President Trump's walk through Lafayette Park to St. John's Church, has written a letter this past Thursday in which he takes issue with the president. And what has become clear is that Milley is not a collaborator with this president. Milley has tried to keep this president from doing some of the things that he has insisted on doing. One more paragraph from James Mattis's op-ed. We can come through this trying time stronger and with a renewed sense of purpose and respect for one another. The pandemic has shown us that it's not only our troops who are willing to offer the ultimate sacrifice for the safety of the community. Americans in hospitals, grocery stores, post offices, and elsewhere have put their lives on the line in order to serve their fellow citizens in their country. We know that we're better than the abuse of executive authority that we witnessed in Lafayette Square. We must reject and hold accountable those in office who would make a mockery of our Constitution. At the same time, we must remember Lincoln's better angels and listen to them as we work to unite. Only by adopting a new path, which means in truth returning to the original path of our founding ideals, will we again be a country admired and respected at home and abroad. I think that last comment deserves comment. Because let's face it, Americans are not the only ones who've been watching what's happening in this country over the last week. Protests have broken out all over the world in support of the opposition to the murder of George Floyd. And one of the things that has become very apparent and people are beginning to appreciate as somewhat concerning is that amongst the things that President Trump has done that bother us, one of the most important is to sever the connections with some of our most important allies. The president has taken it upon himself to repudiate our closest allies, to try to send the message that we're going it alone, that the global network that came out of World War II, that the United States created and continued to lead, is not where Donald Trump thinks that this nation ought to go. And he set out to dismantle it. And he's done it. And Mattis made very clear in his op-ed that he thinks it's a mistake. He recognizes that we have lost status in the world, and that what we have to do is get back to the point where we begin to unite around the principles and the values that cause the rest of the world to respect us before and will cause them to respect us again. Mattis's letter had an even bigger significance. The mere fact that he came out publicly in opposition to Donald Trump has caused others in the military to do the same. And the fact of the matter is, the military has begun to push back, because these protests have grown. They have not dissipated. They have not abated, at least not yet. Not at all. And a lot of columnists, journalists, are making it a point to suggest that Donald Trump and his Republican supporters are really becoming frightened by this. The size and intensity of this protest is giving pause to many Republicans who blindly supported this president in everything he said and everything he did. Now there's some evidence that a number of Republicans are beginning to question their support for this president. A number of them have raised serious questions about whether they'll vote for this president in 2020. It's not a massive revolt amongst Republicans. It's not anything like the 1970s when the Republican leadership marched to the White House and informed President Nixon that his base had abandoned him and that he'd best leave because his support was gone. It's not anything like that yet. It probably never will become anything like that. It's just a few isolated individuals who have openly begun to express serious questions about what the president is doing, what the president is saying, and what re-election of this president for 4 more years might mean. People like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins and others, who gave Donald Trump a pass when he was impeached, but are now beginning to make noises which indicates that they're not about to give him another pass. The president has effectively, this past week, turned Washington into an armed camp. on the assumption that he could do that because he naturally assumed that he had the American military 100% behind him. James Mattis's letter, James Mattis's article, opinion piece, made very clear that the assumption of support from the military that Donald Trump was making might be somewhat misplaced. Mattis did something that military leaders never do. He spoke out. He ended his silence. Mike Mullen, by the end of the week, Mike Mullen came out as well. He was chairman of the Joint Chiefs under Barack Obama. He wrote a piece in The Atlantic in which he said, quote, "I cannot remain silent." And then he goes on. It sickened me yesterday to see security personnel, including members of the National Guard, forcibly and violently clear a path through Lafayette Square to accommodate the president's visit outside St. John's Church. I have to date been reticent to speak out on issues surrounding President Trump's leadership. But we're at an inflection point. The events of the past few weeks have made it impossible to remain silent. Whatever Trump's goal in conducting his visit to St. John's, he laid bare his disdain for the rights of peaceful protest in this country. He gave succor to the leaders of other countries who take comfort in our domestic strife and risked further politicizing the men and women of our armed forces. So said retired Admiral Mike Muller. Retired General John Allen came out next in a piece in Foreign Policy magazine. Quote, "The slide of the United States into illiberalism may well have begun on June 1st, 2020. Remember that date. It may well signal the beginning of the end of the American experiment." More retired generals weighed in later in the week. Two former chairs of the Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey, Richard Myers, both critical of the president's handling of the protests. But perhaps the most extraordinary letter of all was the letter written by the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley. In a letter leaked to Bill Kristol on Thursday, Milley, it appears, met with Donald Trump in the Oval Office last Monday before joining him in that walk down the street cleared by police and National Guard soldiers. David Ignatius in the Washington Post tells us that Milley has a temperature that can match Trump's, and that Milley was vocal in reiterating his advice to the president against mobilizing troops. David Ignatius says 3 knowledgeable sources, on the condition of remaining anonymous, told him about Milley's shouting argument, yelling with Donald Trump. Quote, "They were yelling at each other." Milley sent his letter to the other Joint Chiefs of Staff for the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, National Guard, commanders of combatant commands. David Ignatius says Milley's letter is unlike anything I've ever seen. And David Ignatius said, I've been around the military since I was born in an Army field hospital in Japan in 1947. Milley reminded all those in uniform that their oath is an oath to support the Constitution. Ignatius said, I've never seen that done before. Milley says of the Constitution, this document is founded on the essential principles that all men and women are born free and equal. Lost my place here. That all men and women are born free and equal and should be treated with respect and dignity. The Constitution also gives Americans the right to freedom of speech and peaceful assembly. We in uniform, all branches, all components, all ranks, remain committed to our national values and principles embedded in that Constitution. Then he went on to talk specifically about the National Guard and pointing out that the National Guard is operating under the authority of state governors. David Ignatius believes that for a military man, this is about as close as you ever get to a call for insurrection. Milley's message is written in a code that everyone in uniform will understand implicitly. By reminding every member of the military that the soldiers currently deployed on the street around the country are not there under the authority of the president, and by reminding them of the oath to the Constitution, he's telling them that the military will not be carrying out any un-American orders issued by Donald Trump. Late Friday, Secretary of Defense Esper disarmed the National Guard from Washington, D.C., ordering them to turn in their weapons and ammunition. He then ordered all active duty troops amassed outside the Capitol to be sent home. He issued both of those orders without consulting the White House. All of this began with the letter of James Mattis, and then Mike Mullen, and then Mike Mullen, and then other previous chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It is clear, if ever there was any doubt, Milley's letter made it clear that the military is not with President Trump on any of this. Consequently, the fact that he has, in effect, by building the fence around the White House, turned the White House into a fortress, is an indication of just how different this situation seems to be. I really believe we're seeing something unprecedented in this country. We can continue on this theme, hopefully, in our next program tomorrow. But we've reached the top of our time together, the end of our time together today. For Bob Kincaid and Alice and the folks at Head On, this is Bill O'Brien thanking you so much for tuning in today. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of this Monday. I hope that you'll be able to join us again tomorrow for yet another program here at the Virtual Center. Again, have a wonderful evening and thank you.